The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together.
Well, they didn't.
Very serious. The referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland.
Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast number 26, and this time I spoke with Jack Foster, who is the writer and narrator of a few documentaries you've probably seen. First it was Precious Few Heroes, then he made A Parting Hymn about the Labour Party, and more recently one that I'm sure you've seen, which was the Top 10 Unionist Myths that caused such a stir with Better Together trying to have it taken down. So we'll just go straight to the conversation and I'll have a little word with you at the end. So, hello Jack, how's it going?
Not too bad, Michael, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad, a bit tired, but there you go. The joys of being on holiday.
Alright for some.
Tired for a good reason this time. But okay, so I suppose at this point people already have heard your voice, most of the listeners, and enjoyed the films, but I suppose we should do this in a chronological way. The first film you made was Precious Few Heroes, and could you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to do that and how it was making it, and then the reaction afterwards? It's kind of three things at once there, but there you go.
A Precious Few Heroes was, to some extent, quite experimental, really, because it was the first film of that kind that I'd made, and I was sort of writing it as I went along with Alan Hunter, who was co-writing it with at the time. And I suppose it was kind of a reaction to the 2010 general election, and the kind of, I suppose it was such a kind of damp squib of a result. No one was really happy about it, and it seemed more obvious than ever that Scottish politics was the only way to look for any kind of hope of change. And so, I mean, that's why we started making it. But yeah, as I say, it was quite experimental. So it was a case of building it as I went along. So it wasn't like there was a coherent script to begin with that was built on. It was it sort of came together as it reached the end. But I don't know. I've watched it again recently, and it's not as bad as I remember it, I think.
No, it was excellent. You said it was the 2010 election gave you this kind of idea that it was a bit of a damp squib, but were you always an independence supporter before? Was it something that's always been with you, or was it an idea that you came to because of more recent events?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've always been a supporter of independence. I think it was, I'm trying to think if there was ever a point at which I realised that, but I don't think there was. I mean, for me, it's always just been almost just like a sort of a logical thing. It's not, it's not sort of connected to any sense of Scottishness or anything like that. It just seems really obvious, a basic thing that the people who live somewhere are the best people to run the place. I mean, I can't remember a time when I didn't agree with that. And certainly I think that what Precious Few Heroes, the point of that film was to try and, because no one else seemed to have said it, the independence debate wasn't anything to do with history. It wasn't anything to do with Braveheart or sort of romanticized ideas of Scotland and things. And I mean, I think to some extent there still isn't really much that says that. I mean, there's plenty books, plenty stuff that's been written about it, but people who don't agree or aren't that interested don't tend to read big tomes about Scottish politics.
Do you think you managed to successfully quash the kind of Braveheart bilge narrative? Because I think it's something that I've seen being used less and less, although it still occasionally crops up.
I think it's beginning to become pretty sort of widely accepted that it is a nonsense argument. I think that's really just happened in the last year, though. What with having an official Yes campaign, I mean, I think that's the thing to remember is that when we did Precious Few Heroes, there was no referendum on the cards. The SNP didn't have a majority. There was no referendum. It looked like it was still very much just a sort of an idea of something that could happen in the future. So, I mean, looking at it in the context of now, with a Yes campaign in full swing and just over a year till a referendum on it, it's very different. But I do think that the arguments in terms of, the sort of the old arguments about it's all just about Braveheart, or it's all about oil, or, it's Scotland couldn't afford it. All these sorts of things seem to have, well, they're not quite gone. People are still saying it, on Twitter and Facebook comments and things, but you're not hearing it from any official source now. And I think that's quite a step forward.
Do you think, we'll come back to what you think it is all about in a minute, which I'm sure is very interesting, but you were saying it's stopped more in the last year. Do you think that's a lot because the SNP did win that majority, and, other parties don't want to be seen to basically insulting half the electorate that voted for the SNP?
Oh, I don't know if the unionist politicians have any problem with insulting half of the electorate. I mean, that's never seemed to bother them in the past, but I don't know. I mean, I think I suppose the joy of the SNP having won a majority and then being able to have the referendum is that finally it's no longer about the SNP. They've done their bit in terms of the independence thing. They stood on a ticket of we'll hold a referendum on independence, and they've done that. They've delivered it great, and now it's up to everyone who supports independence to campaign for it, and it's no longer a party political thing.
Well, apart from the films, have you been involved in campaigning in any particular way?
I've done some, but fairly minimal. I think it's always good to play to your strengths. I did a wee bit with the Yes campaign on a couple of their stalls, and I've handed out some leaflets and things, and I'm no doubt I will do over the coming year. I think it's really important that people get involved in that. But it's a very, there's a lot of people involved in that campaign anyway, and I suppose that's what's always been quite comforting whenever I have done anything with them, is to see just how many bodies they've got. And, it's not just a sort of an army of people willing to hand out leaflets. It's so many people that they really know what they're talking about. They're all very kind of clued up about it, all got really intelligent things to say about their vision for independence. And I think that's very comforting. It's always good to see when you can always, I don't know who said it or if anyone said it, but you can tell a lot about someone by the company they keep. And I think that the Yes campaign, you can see that you're in very good company with the Yes campaign. Something which doesn't seem to be quite so much the case with the No campaign, but
yeah, with some particular donors and whatnot, some particular prime ministers that you could.
Well, yeah.
As well. But just another little question I always like to ask when I get the opportunity. So you have done a little bit of campaigning out on the streets, and what's the reaction you're getting? Not from the Yes people, but like from the people you've spoken to in the street. Are you getting a mostly positive, mostly negative, mostly indifferent?
Mostly curious, really. I mean, that's been my experience of it. There's a lot of positive responses. There's a lot of people who largely just want to get involved, and they like to talk about it and things, and they're very pro-yes. And the rest do seem to be very just curious. Something which I'm honestly racking my brain, but I don't actually think I can think of someone who was staunchly, well, there was one guy at the stall at the Meadows Festival, but I don't think he really counts. I think he was swinging a bottle of cider, and he wasn't making a great deal of sense. But I mean, other than him, it's really just curiosity rather than people saying no. There's not really that much of a negative feeling that I've ever seen.
Are you sure the guy swinging cider and being hostile wasn't Ian Davidson?
It could well have been. I mean,
just a thought. It's for the lawyers. But anyway, so let's move on to your second film then, which was Lies, Deceit, and The Death of the Labour Party, which I thought again was an excellent film. What was the inspiration behind that one?
That really, I suppose, came again as after the 2010 general election and the Tory Lib Dem coalition came in. I noticed that all of a sudden, all of these Labour Party supporters and members and MPs were suddenly all out on the streets protesting about these Tory policies and about tuition fees and so on. And I find it really amazing. You sort of think, but for 13 years, we've had a government that's been implementing, by and large, the same kind of stuff, certainly in terms of tuition fees. I mean, the Labour Party did exactly the same thing as the Lib Dems did, in that they promised not to introduce them, and then they did, or at least they promised not to increase them. And it just seemed really hypocritical, and it seemed like there was a real kind of feeling amongst Labour Party supporters that it was like, oh great, we can protest now and kind of just forget that the last 13 years happened. And that, I don't know, that struck me as really dangerous and kind of symptomatic of the whole problem in British politics, which is that the Labour Party doesn't exist anymore. I've heard a lot of people say that was the defining thing about the union, and why there wasn't so much of a feeling for Scottish independence when you had a Labour Party that was implementing things like, bringing things like the NHS and nationalised industry and so on. And it doesn't exist anymore. And that was the thing, the glue, if you like, that kept the United Kingdom together. And it's gone. And I don't really make that much of a secret of my socialist politic. And I think that obviously the biggest betrayal to socialism in this country is the Labour Party, that they abandoned it completely in the interest of power.
And do you think what's being displayed by Labour actives now is very... I mean, you can look at it in a number of ways. It's often said there's lots of... a lot of people say, there's still lots of really good people in the Labour Party, but the problem is that they're nowhere near the top. But then, from what you're saying with the kind of the protests, they're happy to be protesting these policies and not have to be the organisers of it. I mean, do you think what's going on with the Labour Party, it could be extremely cynical, it could be not sure what's going on, or it could be a kind of species of doublethink? I don't know.
I think it's a number of things. What you were saying there about the fact that there are still a lot of good people in the Labour Party is very, very true. But I would argue that that's the problem with the Labour Party. Those good people haven't done anything. They allowed the abolition of Clause 4. They allowed Tony Blair to do everything that he did because they were terrified of not being in power. Another point, and it applies across, it's not just to the Labour Party, which is that of career politicians. And I think both Ed Miliband and David Cameron have never done anything in their lives other than work for their party or student politics since they were students. And I think, that's madness. How can someone run a country if all they've ever done is work for their political party? I mean, no wonder they don't have any policies. No wonder they're only concerned with keeping their party in office.
You said about your socialist policies, and in the documentary you kind of traced through the history of Labour from the original socialist founding principles in the welfare state and the universalist principles. What do you think now of the current Scottish Labour's determination to move away from universalist policies?
In many ways, I feel quite sorry for Scottish Labour because, they're in an even worse position than the Labour Party at UK level because of their stance on independence. They can't be independent, in inverted commas, from the Labour Party. And as we've seen, Joanne Lamont's tried to come up with policy ideas, and then she's quickly told by the London leadership, stop coming up with new ideas, you're not allowed to do that, and then she has to drop them. And she's got her hands tied completely. I do genuinely believe that Joanne Lamont went into politics for the right reasons. I don't think she's very good at it, and it's not really her forte. But I think their hands are tied. They're not really a party. They're more of just a front for the UK Labour Party, really. And what can they do in that situation?
Do you think that the people that are telling her to no, you can't have a policy, is Miliband et al., or is it the Scottish people that are high up in Labour in Westminster? I always think this is an interesting little question.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that we probably won't know for another 50 years until it all sort of comes out, when it doesn't matter anymore. But there does certainly seem to be that sort of group of Scottish Labour MPs who are clearly very powerful, and that largely is the crux of why they oppose independence, because they would lose all of that power overnight. And there must be an element of that. But I mean, I don't know. It's a very difficult one because it's so hard to really understand what they exist for. I mean, their policies now are pretty much the same as the Tories, but just this past week